Okay, greetings everyone. Welcome back. My name is Alex Bryant. I'm a white man in, I'll say, a dimly lit room in front of a yellow background and uh, an apparently open window with not very much light coming through. Um, I am so pleased to introduce Audrey for her talk, Transformative Justice and Disability Justice. Audrey is joining us from the University of Victoria, where she's an associate professor and works on feminist philosophy, specifically on abolition, among other things, of course. But Audrey, we're looking forward to your talk. There'll be a Q&A session afterwards in the chat. And the organizers have asked before we begin that I remind you there will be a social on Zoom after Jonathan Flower's talk. So stick around for that. Okay, Audrey, over to you.
Hey, thank you so much, everyone. So I have dark hair and glasses. It's kind of an olive green shirt. You actually can't see the slogan on it, but it says, "Let this radicalize you." My background is blurred. And I don't know, I look like a somewhat frazzled Southeast Asian woman, which is luckily what I am. So I am going to share my screen right now. Okay, and hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. So my talk, as Alex kindly introduced, is called Transformative Justice and Disability Justice. And so first of all, I wanted to thank everyone for being here, especially the organizers for letting me be part of this super exciting event. This talk is a little bit more programmatic than it is polished. It's drawing a lot from work that I've already done with Barrett Emmerich, which is hopefully forthcoming whenever we get it to the publisher's book. That's arguing for decarceration. I'll talk a little bit more about decarceration and abolition later in the talk, but from a feminist philosophy point of view. And the book talks about decarceration broadly. But this is going to try and draw out some connections between the kinds of strategies we argue for there, with a focus on transformative justice and disability justice. So now there's a map on this screen, and it's kind of a sort of a map with a bunch of overlapping lines and a piece of it highlighted. And it's because I wanted to acknowledge the territory that I'm on, which is unceded Lekwungen territory. So I've got Lekwungen in, in the more traditional kind of phonetic spelling there. So I wanted to say that I live and work on unceded land. So the particular part of what's now called Canada, where I live, it's not exactly treaty territory. But regardless of some of the controversies that people might say about the extent to which treaties cover the southern part of Vancouver Island, whatever agreements were made between the settlers and the Indigenous people here certainly don't cover the atrocities that were committed in the name of colonialism. So part of the reason why I like this map is it shows some of the complexities of overlapping territory. In settler colonial frameworks, we tend to think of borders as just kind of straight, simple lines we can draw on a map because of how settler colonial frameworks tend to treat land. But I think something really different happens when we no longer think of land as something that we're going to own, but as something with which we are in a particular kind of relation. And I'm interested. I always find those kinds of framework shifts really interesting. And so those are the kinds of things that I feel come with transformative justice. So I kind of like this point as a way to set us up. So as for me, I'm an immigrant settler here. So my relationship to the territory is different from other settlers whose families have lived here for more generations. It's also different from that relationship that Indigenous people have who have been here since time immemorial. But it is important to me that the things I do here are done in the spirit of trying to be in a good relationship to land and to the people from whom it was unjustly taken. And so part of the reason why it's really important to me to start out with an extended acknowledgement of colonialism is because one of the things I work on is incarceration and talking about incarceration. It's kind of, I feel for me, it's irresponsible to talk about incarceration without, well, if I ignore the fact that so many Indigenous people are incarcerated in this country. I focus on Canadian statistics because that's where I live. That's the particular carceral system that I'm kind of engaged with. And so a lot of people have been displaced from their ancestral homes, and they've also been forced into captivity, sometimes on the very land that their ancestors have taken care of. So for some statistics, these are the most recent statistics I have. They tend to lag a little bit, a few years behind. So in 2020 to 21, and I'm rounding some numbers here, but approximately 40% of the women and 30% of the men admitted into custody in Canada were Indigenous. But by contrast, about 5% of the country's population is Indigenous. So you can kind of see the vast overrepresentation there of Indigenous people. And the statistics are even higher for Indigenous youth. They make up about 50% of custodial admissions at 8% of the overall population. So, you know, we can, if anyone wants to talk about this more, this is a topic I am always happy to yell about. But hopefully it's not going to be hard to convince folks that these statistics, you know, have to do with ongoing colonialism as a process, over policing communities, punitive foster care system, and structural racism, I think are all contributing factors to some of the statistics on this slide. But this is also going to be a talk about disability and incarceration, and that is going to be much more complicated because it's hard to figure out how many people in prisons are disabled. And part of that is because, so at least I don't think there are extremely sharp lines between who is disabled and who's not. I mean, speaking for myself, that's a boundary that I personally struggle with. I often don't feel as though I fall neatly into the disabled or the non-disabled category for a lot of different kinds of reasons. And secondly, you know, disability, insofar as anything disability related is measured in prisons, it tends to be measured, at least as far as I can find. I'm happy to be corrected on this, but it tends to be measured along a medical model of disability, which I doubt that most folks here would endorse. So the best things that I can find are statistics around the prevalence of certain things like chronic illnesses in federal prisons. These are, for me, the best indicators. But obviously, you know, these kinds of numbers are going to be limited for the reasons that I just mentioned. So, you know, so they have estimates, and these are not exactly from corrections, but from the correctional auditors, that there are about 15% of prisoners, people incarcerated, having some form of respiratory illness, 16% hypertension, 8% diabetes, 16.5 hepatitis, and 27% chronic pain. I know when I have taught folks in prisons, these, you know, I find a lot of them will, you know, some of them have had surgery for chronic pain while they've been taking my classes there. Plenty of them will not necessarily identify as disabled, but will certainly talk about themselves in ways that kind of highlight the effects of various traumas on their mental and emotional life, which, you know, if folks know Jasbir Puar's distinction between debility and disability, I think it might not be hard to make an argument that the conditions of incarceration are debilitating. So again, more things that we can talk more about. There are also a lot of things that can be said about the criminalization of disability. So the prevalence of disability among incarcerated people or justice-involved people, that's not accidental either, particularly among people who face marginalization along other lines. So for example, we have factors like the school to prison nexus. So I choose that phrase rather than the school to prison pipeline, mainly because of Erica Miner's work, who has written pretty compellingly that it's less a pipeline than a web of interconnected threads. Subini Ansi Anima has picked up on that more recently to talk about the pathologization and criminalization of disabled girls of color. Tommy Curry, as just one example, has written about ways that Black male sexuality and disability are constructed and the ways that plays out in anxiety towards Black men's bodies. I think this is something that we have seen over and over again, just in the news when police kill unarmed and disabled Black people. And of course, there are ways that disabled people themselves are held in institutions like psychiatric hospitals, so that for many people, the conditions of disability are also conditions of incarceration. So a lot of the things I know about that, I owe to Liat Ben-Moshe's work. And also, you know, when we turn to academia, there is Margaret Price's really interesting discussion of the rhetoric of mental illness and the school shooter in Mad at School. So there are lots of different threads here about the ways that disability is criminalized. Okay, but now I think that probably for this crowd, I don't need to say as much about disability justice. That's the reason why you're here, but maybe I will need to say a little bit more about transformative justice. So this is just some more framing. I know I'm saying a lot of things. I'm kind of putting out a lot of background, a lot of information. But I promise, try and pull all of the different threads together. So when I talk about transformative justice, this is where a kind of stance of abolition and decarceration comes from. So transformative justice isn't something that I necessarily associate with the work of single individuals. I think it's a movement, it's an abolitionist movement. And the people who shape it, I think the most, the people who shape it, at least in my mind, are fellow survivors of violence, generally people of color, often women of color, who are mainly motivated by building a world in which there's less harm. So folks like Angela Davis, Mariam Kaba, Andrea Ritchie, Shira Hassan, you know, anyone who wants to read more about transformative justice and wants recommendations, just slide into my DMs and I will give you, I will tell you about lots of books that I love. So the main ideas behind transformative justice are that the system, and by the system, I mean the carceral system in this particular case, but I also want you to maybe think about that sort of rhetorical move. We have a carceral system, so a system of prisons and policing that promises something like safety. But when we look at it, when we actually look at how it functions, it does not deliver safety. When we actually look at what police and prisons do, they don't keep people safe. And this is something that I'm also happy to talk about. We think they do, right? They are set up rhetorically in the public imagination for us to think that they keep people safe. But in general, they don't. Prisons are an immense site of harm. A great deal of violence takes place in prisons, and often behind closed doors. So transformative justice is a stance that says we don't want violence, we want less violence. The carceral system is not helping us stop violence. So what we need to do is turn away from state-based solutions and towards creating conditions of support and safety and changing the background conditions that produce harm in the first place. So we want something else. Okay? And this is where defunding the police as a slogan comes in. Defund the police, and this is something that I take to be a crucial part of transformative justice that I'm going to be talking about more. It's not just a negative project. So it's not just a project of saying, shut down all the police departments. There's an essential constructive part of that project, which says we want to put those resources into communities. Even though we might not know exactly what is going to be built, okay, and we may not have exact recipes for what is going to be built. So it's constructive, but admitting that there is not going to be a clear roadmap because things are messy. And attempts at solutions will often fail at first, right? Attempts to build something better is probably going to fail at first. Just as we are all raised in worlds shaped by lots of different kinds of oppressive ideologies, probably whatever gets built at first, assuming the police ever does get less money, whatever gets resourced first, might well still be shaped by a kind of carceral thinking, because that's how we've been trained. Okay, so here, a few things maybe I should just be clear about before I keep going. So like I said, the project of abolition isn't just to close prisons, but it's to transform the conditions of harm in the first place. So, a lot of people might be okay with reducing the power, that the prisons and police have, but still keeping them. Insofar as we are trying to at least divert some of those resources to community-based solutions to keep ourselves safe from harm, we can at least walk together for at least some of that. Things get complicated, right? It's not as though abolitionists think that we just close all the prisons today and fire all the cops today, and then everything's fine, because we haven't built the structures and the systems yet that allow us to care for each other. Okay, small confession time. So I thought about giving an easy talk. By easy, I mean a kind of comfortable talk for me. So the easy talk I was going to give was going to be an argument that people who care about disability justice should also be abolitionists, or at least work in a transformative justice paradigm. But then, listening, so this is like the kind of good and bad part about being on the last day of a conference. Even though it's still before 9 a.m. and I have not been able to make it to nearly as many sessions as I would like. But, listening to the last few days of talks, thinking about just how many systems disabled people run up against, especially in academic settings, I kind of wanted to push things a little bit further. So I went a little bit, but also, I didn't tell anyone exactly what I was going to talk about anyway, but I think, in the interest of transparency, I'm going to tell you that this is where I went a little rogue in my own planning for this talk. I don't think I'll apologize though. I think I'm okay with it. Okay. So let's pull all of this. I'm going to do my best to pull all of this together. Okay. So talking about abolition. So abolitionists, prison and police abolitionists, are pretty clear that prisons and police need to be abolished instead of reformed. So there's a distinction to be made here. So from an abolitionist perspective, we don't want kinder, gentler prisons. We want entirely different things in their place, even if we don't know exactly what is going to be there. Softer prisons and softer police is not the goal. So this means distinguishing between reformist reforms and abolition. So for example, from an abolitionist perspective, you might criticize something like, extra police training, or body cams, even body cams, because they increase the scope and resources given to policing. And so they increase, right? So the extra training and extra body cameras, extra equipment, means the police get more resources, not fewer. And from the abolitionist perspective, it is not the state, at least not in that form, that's going to reduce harm. It's going to be people. So we need to, take away the training money, and give it to, say, the people who are trying to run a harm reduction program in their own community, right? That's just like one rough idea. But this means there's some tricky decisions to be made, right? So not everybody who criticizes mass incarceration or policing is pro-abolition. Some people might not think we need to abolish prisons entirely, and would be actually pretty happy if we had a carceral system that more resembles, say, Norway's, which, in many ways we might think is much more reasonable, right? The conditions of incarceration there are pretty different. So this means we have some kinds of questions when we think about systems that don't work. So, given all that we've said here, all that lots of you amazing and brilliant people here have said about academia, what should our stance towards it be? What is our stance towards the different systems within academia? Going to be one of abolition, or is it going to be one of reform? And either way, I think there's complicated questions. So if we think there are systems that need to be abolished, then I think we need to take some lessons from people who have been working on abolishing systems for a really long time, and say, well, look, we don't just abolish. It's not an entirely negative project. We have to think about what is going to fill the space that those systems are taking up right now. There has to be an essential constructive component to whatever it is that we do. So, for example, I've taught this paper on by Reem Coheson and Liam Bright on, is peer review a good idea? And I talk to students and I say, the students are really on board. Like, oh yeah, peer review is broken. Like, here are all these different problems with peer review. Like, yes, this negative project, this totally makes sense. But then when I say, okay, yeah, I mean, there are all these problems with peer review, we can see them. So what do we want instead for systems of research communication? And then, and then the conversation gets much more difficult. Because, it's like, yeah, peer review is a terrible idea, except, it's the worst idea, except for all the other ideas or something, tends to be the outcome of those kinds of discussions. And I think this kind of conversation, I think, illustrates the importance of the kinds of constructive projects. So the task of abolition, whatever systems it is that I think we want to abolish, is necessarily also going to be constructive and requires and relies heavily on radical imagination. And honestly, I think this is hard for a lot of us who are trained as philosophers. I'm not going to say everybody, not everybody has had the same training. But I think that a lot of our philosophical training is destructive. Right? We are often trained to be able to criticize, to make negative arguments, right? To say what's broken and to say what's wrong. And I think that the work of transformative justice, in whatever sphere we're going to try and apply it, I think that work will require, to some extent, resisting our philosophical training, insofar as we are trained to show what's wrong. We do need to see what's wrong, right? That's not to say that the criticism is unimportant, but we can't just criticize. that can't be an abolitionist stance. Okay, one last thing, just to make all of this more complicated, which, you know, like I said at the very start, I am doing all of this work on stolen territory. So the very preconditions for me being able to do any anti-oppressive work are preconditions of oppression and injustice. You know, if we're thinking about abolition in an academic context, you know, most of us who are trying to work against injustice are doing so with dirty hands. You know, I might think that there are a lot of problems with academia, but it also pays my bills. So, you know, whatever I do in this, I need to decide how much, you know, how much of this will still license me to work within the system. I mean, I have this conversation with former students all the time, right? So I live in a provincial capital, so lots of the students that I teach will end up going to work for the provincial government. And I sometimes have these conversations with them after they graduate. You know, they'll come back and they'll say, like, I'm kind of stressed out. Like, am I now reinforcing, you know, structural injustice? Like, am I now in the system and I'm doing bad things? And so the kind of conversation, or what I was just talking about, this is kind of drawn from a lot of conversations that I've had with my students as they try and wrestle with the extent to which they're complicit in systems that they just really don't know if they endorse. And so I am taking those conversations and trying to have them with myself and maybe with all of us collectively. And so, you know, here, right, what is the place of academic disability justice? So Jay Dolmage criticizes retrofits, right? Things that are just kind of bolted on at the end to for inclusion. So is academic disability justice going to end up being a retrofit or something else? And this is not a rhetorical question. This is not me saying it is necessarily a retrofit. But you know, I think this is kind of a problem that we end up being confronted with. So to what extent are we limited because we are thoroughly embedded in a system that we might be trying to change? Okay. And when I say we, I have to recognize, right, that not all of us here on this call are positioned in exactly the same way within the system. But, you know, chances are most of us are here because of some connection that we have with academic institutions, right? Those are enabling the work that we're able to do. So, you know, this, I think, is a problem, right? This is part of the mess of resisting oppression and actually trying to see the world for what it is instead of what we might wish it could be, right? It would be a lot simpler if there were easier stories that we could tell about what's bad and what's good. But I just don't think that most of those stories are so easy. Okay, so to finish up, I promise this is my last point because I think I am just at time. Here is one suggestion, okay, that I want to make, and mainly I'm just hoping this is going to be helpful for us. For me, maybe I'm giving this talk partly for me. That's okay. So I think some of us, you know, see our academic work as having implications about how we should live. Right? So to that extent, at least, I think I'm an activist, because I think that it would be pretty weird if I came to some of the conclusions I did in doing my philosophical work and did not find that that had implications about how to live. So assuming we're going to stay in academia, right? Keeps the lights on. What should we expect of the institution? What solutions, what structures should we expect that institutions can provide for us? And what has to be created ourselves in a community of care with each other? So because I realize this point might not be clear, I'm going to briefly illustrate it. Lots of people who maybe look like me, right? Women of color who seem who seem sympathetic, right, will end up spending a lot more time, with students, crying in our offices. We will talk to them. We will care about them. This is a good thing. And sometimes, I have this conversation with other people who are doing similar things. And we're like, we love this, but it's kind of tiring. And, we have a little bit less time because lots of our other colleagues don't have to do this. And sometimes we think maybe the university should somehow be able to credit us for the fact that we do so much work. Maybe we need credit for it. And I think the more I think in these ways, the less I think that this is a situation where I want the institution to reward me for doing this aspect of my job. I don't want this to actually be something that is institutionally measured. And the more I just want this to be a space where necessarily in an institution that wasn't entirely built for folks like me, folks like lots of my students in mind, this is a place where we need to provide care for each other. Maybe I don't want the university to give me more merit points for caring about my students. Maybe I just need more of a community, which I think I am growing to have. I'm pretty lucky of other people who will also care for me when I need it too. So on that note, thank you so much for being here, for listening, for indulging me as I go rogue. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides now. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Audrey. Let's give Audrey a round of applause and we can turn to Q&A. Thank you so much for your talk. Oh, many reactions popping up on the right side of my screen. Audrey, there's a first question from Lori already in the Q&A. Can you see the Q&A part of the meeting? Okay.
I can see the Q&A. Thank you so much, Lori. Is it good if I read the question out before I answer it? Probably. I'm going to say it's good if I read it out. So Lori, thank you so much for this probing and important talk. I have lots of questions, but let me just ask two. First, if you thought about how to respond to those philosophers and others who are currently trying to defend carceral systems to some extent. Tommy Shelby's new book, for example, comes to mind. Second, I wonder if you have any thoughts to share about the relationship between transformative justice and an ethics of care. So in my own voice, this is Audrey now. Although really, if I could just, spend a lot more time speaking as Lori Gruen, I think, I don't know, I think I would probably produce a lot more philosophical work and I'd really enjoy it too. Thanks, Lori. So first of all, yes, of course, you were entitled to ask me these giant questions, given that I'm pretty sure I did the same to you. I have thought about responding to people who are trying to defend carceral systems. I think, and even talking to folks who have very thoughtfully, who very thoughtfully kind of consider themselves to be carceral feminists. So I think to some extent, I haven't read Tommy Shelby's new book. I do really want to, though. I think to some extent, we can work alongside each other for a while. I think that being attentive to some of the distinctions between abolition and reform, I think that there is some way that I think I can walk together with people who want to maintain some form of carceral system. So I think as long as folks are okay for now, because I think we are so far away from the end goal, that I think as long as folks are okay for now, with just saying, but surely we need to reduce the scope. Can we at least reduce the scope of carceral systems for now? Even if you think we should not reduce it to zero, can we at least redirect our resources to other things? And at the very, at the very least, I think we can go that far. I know that's a little bit of a cop-out, but to some extent, I feel like we don't necessarily need to answer to kind of, we don't necessarily need to have that argument now. I kind of want us to work together and have that argument later. And do I have thoughts? Yes. Transformative justice and an ethics of care. Hell yes. I think it's necessary. So I think that the constructive work that we need to do, I think can very readily be informed by an ethics of care. I think this is absolutely an excellent model for us, for us to be working in moving forward. Because I think that exactly the point, right, is if we are moving away from something like a retributive system, what do we do, right? It has to be a system that's grounded in something entirely different, right? Possibly an ethics of care that has us, thinking about each other's needs first. Hopefully that was an answer. There is a lot of stuff though that I want to think about more in there. So thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. I saw Jonathan Wolf had a question, but the hand has gone down, and then Jorge has a question in the chat. Jonathan, do you still have your question?
So let Jorge go first, and then I'll ask after. So prioritize the Q&A because I've had a lot of attention.
Okay.
No problem. So Audrey, Jamie just mentioned, I'll read the questions out to you.
Okay.
More dialectical. Okay, so Jorge says, thank you for that, Audrey. I am thinking about the predominance of distributed justice in Western political philosophy and the inclination of the dominant Rawlsian tradition to subsume all social problems to that kind of justice. This has caused a large split between different disciplines talking about justice and political philosophers. Would your proposal to make carceral and transformative justice equivalent to distributive justice, or would you subordinate it to an issue of distributive justice as well? As in, would your proposal require us to conceive of issues of carceral justice as an issue of distribution or as another area of justice altogether?
Buddy, you're gonna make me talk about Rawls? What is this? You're lucky we're friends. Otherwise, I'd be mad about this. I'd be mad about this whole thing. I don't know. I mean, I think my totally off the cuff reaction is to say that I want to go back to Laurie's question about the kind of question of ethics of care. Which is that I don't think that the problems, I don't think that thinking of certain kinds of things as goods to be distributed is going to be an especially helpful way for us to care for each other effectively. So, I mean, I think, distributive justice may be fine for some kinds of things. But I think that as with a lot of things in kind of the Western political philosophy tradition, they're pretty limited in scope. And transformative justice people, like, they think big. And I kind of love that. I love how big abolitionists think. Because I think that they are thinking about how do we live together in a world where we can all thrive. Where thriving is measured in so many more terms than just kind of what we have. Like, it's not just the having of things. So I think that, you might be able to get a distributive justice paradigm, a kind of distributive justice way of talking about it. But I think that maybe what I want to say is like, just think bigger. Just think bigger about all the other things that we might be able to do if we stop thinking about our particular kinds of paradigms of justice. Like, if we lose our attachment to those particular kinds of paradigms. This is why I'm lucky. I wasn't trained as a proper political philosopher, so I don't have to.
Thank you, Audrey. I'm going to go to. I'm going to say your name, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Roatan Flynn. The question is, The history of institutionalization of disabled people is still visible in attitudes to especially people classified as cognitively or intellectually disabled, e.g., through social segregation, gender segregation, exploitative labor, denial of voting rights. Do you see historical attitudes about cognitive intellectual disability built into carceral systems, e.g., ideas of subnormalcy, social purification, eugenicist principles?
Fucking right, I do. Sorry, that was not a very professional answer, but yeah, it's garbage. They have so the prison where I teach, you know, the psychiatric, like their nickname, like the kind of internal nickname for people. So there's a special kind of psychiatric unit, right, where people are held who are seen as disabled in certain particularly dangerous, or, you know, I don't know how they classify people into that unit, but they tend to call them bugs, like bugged out or something like that. Like that's the kind of internal name for the people in that unit. Right, I know, exactly. So yeah, so internal to the system, I think that there is plenty of that. But also, you know, I think that part of the problem with, and this actually goes back to some of the kind of Margaret Price stuff and some of the earlier kind of criminalization of disability stuff, right? I think that, well, at least when white people commit mass murder, they're often seen primarily through the paradigm of mental illness instead of something else. And this causes huge massive problems, right? So I think that some people are seen as kind of criminally disabled in those ways. But even then, you know, I think to add to another aspect of what you're talking about, I think that you can't really untangle, I don't think you can untangle carceral systems from other kinds of eugenic systems, where I think that there's entirely a connection there between something like incarceration and something like forced sterilization. I think both of them are continuous with the same kind of apparatus of control of undesirable folks, or like confinement, or ways that people who are seen as quote unquote undesirable are not, you know, they're not supposed to participate in normal life. Massive separation of people from their children while they're incarcerated as well, right? People's like, man, my students miss their children. They really miss their kids. They love their kids. A lot of their kids love them. And separation is absolutely there. And I'm sure it would be even worse if there even was a women's facility on Vancouver Island that I could work with. There is no women's prison here. Any woman who is held here has to go to the mainland, even farther away from anyone here who might love her. So sorry, I took it as an excuse to rant, but I think the rant was relevant. I hope so.
Thanks, Audrey. We have about less than 7 minutes, and we have 3 questions. I'm gonna go Anna Mudd, then Kristen Rodier, then Chris. Anna's question is, thanks, Audrey, so wonderful. My question follows on your very important insight that we'll need to unclench from critique in order to do abolition. In many contexts, I struggle with the, quote, must act moment as in tension with the, quote, getting the problem right, not moving too fast, etc. moment. I wonder about what your thinking is, both about the sort of experiential temporality of that, but also about how to characterize and or manage that kind of tension or the other resonant ones.
Oh, Anna, such a good question. Yeah, I mean, universities love their multi-year consultation processes that result in no actual change. And I don't think that is a you thing. I think that is just the kind of the extended results of the like, oh, we don't want to move too fast. We want to consult with all stakeholders. And after consulting with all stakeholders, we find that we are not doing anything. I think you're right that is a tension. We don't want to screw things up. But I think that we also just sometimes need to be more comfortable with screwing stuff up. I think that we also need to find better ways of telling each other when we have screwed up, in ways that don't necessarily presume bad faith, right? And I think sometimes there is bad faith, but I think we need, I just think about how much better I talk philosophy with people who can tell me that they think I'm wrong in ways that are still constructive, right? And I think about that when I think about community building, right? Like, I want people to tell me when I have screwed it up, but I want them to tell me in ways that I think that might be constructive. Like, how can we do this better next time? Like, that was bad. Like, that didn't work. How can we do this better next time? Like, that's what I want. But I also, and I think we're also terrible at that as philosophers too. We're just like, that was bad, done, right? Toss that theory on the bin. But I also am enough of a Buddhist here to have like kind of tacked on some principles about trying to do the right thing without a necessary attachment to outcome. And I know I've just opened a giant can of worms right there, but there are a whole bunch of things that I'm thinking about in that respect that I would love to talk to you about later. So sorry
yes,
if that was
great reason to attend the social after Jonathan Flower's talk. We'll go to Christine Ridge's talk. Your final section made me think about Ethel Tungahan's work on academic anti-work in the academy. So much of what needs to be done is unraveling philosophical training, which is a hard claim to put forward within the existing structure. It calls out method and professional norms, etc. Your talk makes me think about the harm-reducing choice to just leave philosophy for political science or gender studies or cognate areas. I'm inviting you to go a bit more rogue here.
I love that you're an enabler there, Kristen. Thank you so much. So also, I freaking love the academic auntie work. So as as an Asian person, I actually love being an auntie, and I love all things auntie. So I think I am culturally obligated to do that. Even though I kind of want to go rogue, I've totally thought about this. I have totally thought, like, do I just quit and like try to move over to gender studies? And then I actually realized, like, during the pandemic, when I wasn't necessarily hanging out with like quote unquote normal philosophers, I was pretty much only hanging out with people who I think were doing good work in the kinds of ways that I think are productive. So I feel like, maybe this is just, maybe this means that philosophy is siloing in certain kinds of ways, but I feel like that there are so many philosophers, some of whom are here, honestly, doing exactly the kinds of things that I think we ought to do, and messing with disciplinary norms in exactly the ways that I think we ought to. But I actually do think now that, like, I'm happy to stay in philosophy because I now know the people that I can talk to. Like, I think there is some benefit to certain kinds of philosophical methods, certain kinds of types of philosophical inquiry. And I just needed to, like, my first inkling, honestly, was like, I don't know, 10 or so years ago, the first time I went to CSWIP, I was like, oh, people are helpful in conference? Like, whew, that's wild. And so, so I think I think I'm okay. And also I think political science is not the place for us either. I have hung out with some of our political science department, and I don't think that's where we need to go either. So no, I think we got this. I think we can just, I think we can claim our space. I think we can create exactly the kinds of communities and not necessarily expect the like massive prestige and, whatever the prestige hierarchy of academic philosophy. I think we can kind of take care of ourselves too. I think there's enough of us. So yeah, thank you.
Well, on that excellent note, we're going to have to wrap up here. I know Chris and Jonathan, you both had further questions. Please do attend the social shortly, as Jamie has raised in the chat, to pursue those. But for now, let's thank Audrey for this excellent talk and discussion. Thank you so much, Audrey.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Alex, for chairing, and Audrey, really provoking discussion of which I have much to add to in the conversation in the future. I'm at the Blavatnik School of Government and teach on a course called Master of Public Policy. So all of these issues around change are sort of meat and drink to me, but also incredibly tough. So we have 10 minutes. We'll be back on the half hour. So presenters and chair for the next session, if you can please go backstage so we can sort out slides and any other organizational matters, and we'll be back on the half hour. And then, as has been said, that will be followed by the social, for which a Zoom link will be put in the chat. So see you all just in a few minutes.